Hey everybody, it's another majestic INFJ. One quick housekeeping thing. On my last video where I was doing another response video to the polar test, um, I mentioned a YouTube channel that does a really funny job of doing skits about MBTI and stuff. And I I think I might have called it Meet Kristen, but it's actually Dear Kristen. Um, I'll put a link to that, but check it out. It's just really funny. So if I said the wrong name, I'm sorry. But hopefully you guys will find it. It's hilarious, and you probably all have seen it anyways. Okay, so for this video, I've mentioned a few times that I wanted to do a video on sort of mapping different brain areas to the different functions in a way that Dario Nardi has done with some of his research. And, I eventually I'll put up, a video or a series of videos on this stuff, but I wanted to sort of revisit things because it's been a while since I was in grad school and dealt with all this brain behavior stuff, and I just kind of wanted to see what is new out there. I wanted to try to read Nardi's book, just see what he's been saying lately, because honestly it's been a while. But in the process of doing that, I went back and I've been going through this book. I don't know if that's going to show up backwards or not, but it's called Descartes Error, and it's by a guy, Antonio Damasio. And for those of you who may not know, Damasio was a very big very big in the neuroscience world, and in particular, what this book is about, Descartes' Error, on how emotion is intertwined with reason, logical reason, or just sort of rational behavior is probably the better way to describe it. And just as a little plug, I guess, when I was in grad school, we worked with his lab quite a bit with some of the neurological patients that he saw. And most of his work was dealing with neuropsych patients. So patients that had some sort of lesion to, in one or more areas of the brain. And usually they were lesions that were, associated with emotion and, emotional regulation, things like the amygdala, and certain areas of the limbic system, but also certain areas of the prefrontal cortex, which I usually describe as sort of your FE area. But then there's also people who have damage that would probably be more associated with your FI area, and I'm going to sort of dig into that in a second here. But his big claim to fame was that it's that people with damage to these areas that we typically consider, quote unquote, emotional areas, they have breakdowns in acting logical or acting rational, in a way that you wouldn't expect if you're sort of an MBTI purist, or, a purist in other ways, where you sort of think of logic and emotion as being two completely separate things. And, the more emotional you are, the less logical you are. And the more logical you are, the less emotional you are. Especially in the MBTI community, and especially if you're sort of new to it and just sort of figuring this stuff out, there is sort of a tendency to think of them as, acting completely independently of each other, and and inversely related, right? So the more that you are a feeler, the less you are a thinker, or the more you are a thinker, the less you are a feeler. So there might be something to that, right? I mean, they're clearly different systems. They could be inhibiting each other in various ways, but to have sort of a full blown rationally acting person, you need both, and that's what Descartes' error um, gets into and describes. And I recommend, those of you who are interested in this kind of stuff to go to read it. It came out, I think, in the 90s. I'm sure he's released other stuff since then. Um, but this was sort of like, the thing that sort of set off, or, sort of introduced to this theory to the world. Okay, so let's talk about it. And then, see how it ties to MBTI, and might also sort of change your mind a little on how you approach these things. So the argument here, so like I said, he would study patients with neurological damage to some sort of emotional part of the brain. And he starts off the book talking about sort of probably the most famous neuropsych patient out there, this guy named Phineas Gage, who I think was back in the late 1800s, maybe early 1900s. But he suffered brain injury because I forget the details, but I think he was walking by where they were laying down railroad track or something, and like dynamite, there was some sort of explosion, and one of those railroad ties, right, those big metal spikes that go through the railroad tracks, got lodged, it flew and got lodged into his head and went in and out. And he ended up surviving, but he had a severe lesion to what we would now call, where would that be? Probably the medial frontal cortex, that has to do with sort of emotional regulation, dealing with emotions, but not at like a core level, at more of like a cognitive conscious level. Probably what you would normally think of as FE, right? And so this was a guy who was just sort of a normal guy, but then as soon as he got this damage, he just, could not control his emotions, would just fly into rages all the time. And also just like could not um function, just on day-to-day activities, right? Like just couldn't hold down a job, couldn't pay his bills on time, all that kind of stuff that is just sort of acting and functioning normally, in society. And it wasn't so much that, he just was this angry person and refused to do anything, but he really had a hard time, what I would argue, sort of prioritizing things or ordering his life. And a lot of times we think of, ordering things and putting things into, or, acting rationally, acting logically, as a TE or a thinking function. But here, what Damasio argues is that really your emotional center is giving you the sense of priority, right? And so what Phineas Gage, the patient, the guy who had the railroad tie go through his head, he couldn't prioritize things. He couldn't organize his life in any sort of um, coherent way, right? And Damasio talks about other patients that he studied, and he'd give examples of, somebody, and this is sort of typical, right? You have somebody who, is in their, 40s or 50s. They've held down a job their whole life. They've been, in the workforce for a while, and then they get some sort of injury and they just can't function in their job anymore. But they can do the day-to-day tasks for the most part, right? So you can give them um like math problems to solve, or you can give them, a written, a few written paragraphs, and they understand what the paragraphs are saying, and you can ask them questions about the meaning and all that kind of stuff, right? So they haven't completely lost all conscious, or cognitive abilities, but what they lack, well, let me describe, how it sort of manifests in behavior. So if they have a certain type of damage in a certain type area of the brain, they have difficulty, like I said, coming up with sort of a coherent plan of action. And so the example he would give is, let's say you work for a business and you have to hire somebody, right? And when you hire somebody, there's a lot of factors that go into it, right? Like, what's their experience? Where did they go to school? What were their grades like? Do they have, how old are they? How young are they? Now, you're not really supposed to take that into account, but there's a lot of, factors that go into whether or not you hire somebody. Um, and eventually you have to make a decision, right? Let's just say it's just one person, and the decision is, do I hire this person, or do I not hire this person, right? And you can take in all these factors, but ultimately you have to come up with a decision. Now, we like to think that this is sort of a TI, maybe TE type of task, right? That we're going to take all this information in, and we're going to come up with some sort of logical decision. Who's the best candidate, or is this person a fit or not a fit for our, you know, for our company? Are they capable or not? But, and even just, disregarding whether or not you like the person, right? Let's just say you never even meet the person. It's just all on paper, right? You're just getting information on paper and you have to make a decision, so it's not like, do I like this person or not? You're not basing it off that. You're basing it purely off of their credentials, right? Where'd they go to school? What was their major? What were their grades like? All that kind of stuff. What's their prior work history? Just stuff on paper. And you would like to think that you're using your TI or TE type functions to come up with an answer. But what he argues is, when you have patients like this, like, they cannot make a decision, right? And they will literally stay there all day trying to decide, whatever the decision is. Do I hire this person? Do I hire that person? Or if it's just one person, do I hire them or do I not hire them? Doesn't matter how easy the decision is, they cannot make the decision. And his argument is that what your emotional center is doing, partly, it's doing lots of things, but one of the things that it's doing is it's prioritizing the different factors that are going into your decision, right? So if you know, so for example, if you got a application and you did a background check and you found out that this person um, went to jail for, like, embezzling money or fraud or something, right? Like, your immediate reaction would be like, no, we're not hiring this person. And Damasio would argue, okay, well, that's an emotional reaction. Like, you have an emotional trigger that is saying, okay, this is a strong enough negative, right, in my decision making, that I'm just, I'm going to say no right away and not go any further, right? Now that's an extreme example. What do you do when somebody doesn't really have anything, like no jail sentence, nothing that bad going against them? Well, you have to still sort of prioritize what you think of each of these factors, right? Like maybe the school that they went to isn't as important to you as what they majored in, right? Or what they majored in isn't as important to you as what their grade point average is. Or maybe their work history is more important than all of that, right? Like maybe they worked for one of the biggest firms in your area, and you and doesn't really matter what they got in school or what school they went to. You're more interested in their work experience, right? Now again, we like to think of that as sort of a logical process, right? That we're rank ordering things based off of logic. But if you get damage to these emotional areas of your brain, you will lose the ability to do that. At least that's Damasio's argument, and he's got plenty of evidence to back it up. And again, what his argument is each of those factors, right? Like prior work experience or where you worked before, you're going to tag sort of an emotional tag to it. You're going to tag an emotional tag to it, or you're going to assign an emotional sort of value, right? Like I really value this and I don't value this as much, right? And then ultimately you're going to come up with a decision based off of where you ranked everything in all those factors, right? So there might be one deciding factor that just says, no way, we're not hiring this guy because he went to jail for fraud or embezzlement. Okay, fine. That's an easy one. But again, if you've got 5 or 6 factors and they're all sort of equal, in some part of your brain, you got to, come up with a decision. And that means you have to prioritize what you think is important and go off of that. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. It's what he calls the semantic marker hypothesis, where each sort of thought or representation that we have that sort of springs up in our brain, we assign some sort of value to it, um, and then we use those values to make our decisions. And if you lose that function, then you have a very hard time just quote unquote acting rationally, right? Um, and because you can't come up with a coherent decision. And so people with these lesions, they can't hold down a job. They have a very hard time holding down relationships, very hard time just taking care of themselves. And again, it's not because they physically can't do it. It's just they can't assign values and prioritize things in the way that we do without even thinking about it, right? And so imagine living your life where you can't assign values to things and you can't prioritize what's important to you and what's not, or what's more important to you right now, or what's important to you in the long term, right? Like they can't do any sort of that long term type planning because it takes the ability to assign value to it, to assign importance to it. So what does this have to do with MBTI? Well, I would my argument, and this is just me, this is not anything that Damasio has said, or as far as I know, anybody else. So don't attribute it to him. But the way that I see it is that this is basically what FI is doing, right? This is, and to some extent FE, right? There's going to be a lot of gray area here. But in a large part, what FI is doing, like I've talked about, is every time you see an object or hear of a concept or there's a new representation just coming to your brain just automatically assigns some sort of positive or negative value to it. Now, a lot of things you might be quote unquote ambivalent about, where You could take it or you could leave it. It's a little bit positive in one situation, it's maybe a little bit negative in another. Excuse me. But, you do have some sort of value that you're assigning to these things, and your brain just sort of does it automatically. And so somebody with FI, y- you know, I would argue, strong, well-developed FI users are very good at assigning the value and then also sort of recognizing the value, being able to prioritize things in a meaningful way, right? And it might not be just like, what's valuable to me and what are my internal values. It really is like, you know, how do I rank these various things in sort of a cost benefit kind of way, right? And what's gonna be the most beneficial to me or maybe my family or my company, um, versus things that aren't going to be as beneficial, or maybe what's going to be detrimental to me, that kind of stuff. And to do any sort of long-term planning, you have to be able to prioritize things like that. And again, we like to think of it as kind of a TI rational thing, but I'd argue that no, it's more of an FI thing. Now, that being said, we're all aware of sort of the stereotype of like the INFP or maybe the ISFP, that they're sort of dithering and they've a hard time making up their mind, and they're sort of flighty in a way. Now, first, I don't really think they're like that. I think that's very much a stereotype. And if they are, they're probably pretty young and haven't really developed their FI. Um, and so, like in most things in biology, you know, if you have too little of it, it's kind of an inverted U, right? So if you have too little of it, it's a problem, right? So if you have brain damage to those areas, you just can't function and you can't prioritize or do any sort of long-term planning. But if you have too much of it, let's just say you're a really, really heavy FI user and your brain is just supercharged, assigning values to things all the time. Now it might be more difficult, right? The more you have, um, to make a decision because you're thinking about it too much, right? So instead of not thinking about it at all or thinking about it too little, you might be thinking about it too much, or a heavy FI user might be thinking about it too much. But what you'll see in like, a lot of the INFPs on YouTube that, are a little older and have, probably gotten, through a lot of their sort of brain development phase, they just have this way about them to where like they seem to have a very coherent view of the world, you know, and I hesitate to say rational view of the world or logical view, because it does come across as very rational and very logical. But I don't want to confuse TI with FI. But with them, it's like they just have this like this aura. Trying to articulate it and not use the word aura or things like that. But they really do have just this vibe that they give off, that they've got a very well thought out argument when they're making their arguments, and very well thought out plan of attack, when they talk about things. And it's not just so much like, they're just, rock solid with their convictions, and, that might be part of it. But I think it's because they do a very good job of prioritizing. Like they know it's important and they know it's not important. Um, and because of that, they're able to sort of parse out and do this very sort of long-term planning, and just have sort of a coherent, cohesive view of the world, I think is what I'm trying to say. Right. So watch a couple of INFPs, especially, I'm having a hard time remembering who they are. I'll try to find some and link them below, but there's a few that come to mind that just seem very sharp. They seem very sharp, but not in that kind of like TI way where they're just gonna, pick apart anything you say and, try to make it more precise or more logical. But it's sharp in this just this like well put together, cohesive view of the world. And because they're, using their any tool, they're very good at articulating it, right? Unlike me right now, where I'm trying to articulate, what I'm thinking or my description of this, but they've got that any, and so it just comes across as just very smooth and very just like right on, when you listen to him. I wish I could articulate it better than I am. I need an INFP to do it for me. Um, so that being said, I think MBTI is just full of contradictions and things that you know, right when you think you've got it, right when you think you understand FI, then somebody comes across along and gives you like a totally different, explanation of FI, or you see somebody who tests as an INFP or an ISFP, and you're just like, no way, that can't be FI. Well, think about it this way, think about Descartes' Error. I would invite you to read it if you really are interested in this stuff, and think about how, logic and acting rationally is not just pure TI. It's not just pure, computer formal logic, right? We as humans introduce this prioritizing function into the decisions we make, right? And even if you are a thinker as opposed to a feeler in your MBTI parlance, you are still using, some level of FI or feeling, to make your TI decisions. At least that's what Damasio would say, and then also vice versa. I think when you're making your FI decisions, you're using some TI too, right? And that's one of the traps that a lot of people fall into is they just sort of think of them as mutually exclusive. You're either an FI user or a TI user. And, that's certainly not true, right? I mean, we're all going to use a little bit of all of it. It's just sort of, how much, right? And how much attention does it take? Okay. I think I've babbled on enough about this. I hope I get the point across about what Damasio's somatic marker theory is. Look it up. I'm sure there's a wiki article or something about it. And it might help you, again, sort of deal with sort of the paradoxes or the conflicts of MBTI and trying to figure out, whether something's TI or FI. And hopefully it doesn't confuse you even more. Or when you see an INFP who comes across as very like rational and very reasonable, but they're an INFP. Why aren't they an INTP? They seem so rational and reasonable and not crying all over themselves. Well, it's because most likely, this FI is a very critical component of acting rationally and figuring out how to prioritize things, right? And when you read, if you read this book, what I'd argue is, you will probably you'll probably come away from it realizing that FI just isn't about emotion and crying and then telling everybody what you value and what you think, but really it's about prioritizing. It is really its core function, right? You've got all these things that are out in the world and all these decisions you have to make and all these factors you have to weigh when making your decision, and you somehow have to prioritize what is important and what's not important, or what's important in this context might be different in another context, right? And that's what all that FI stuff is doing. Okay. um So I think that's it. Let me know if you've got any feedback. And again, I hope I didn't just completely muddle everything with my inability to describe the INFP. And I hope they don't take any offense. All right. Have a good night. I'll talk to you later.